I would like to say that we really had that pleasure to read two great books by Stathis Gourgouris, Dream Nation and Does Literature Think? ? And I can retell my impressions of reading, but I would rather pose two questions to Stathis. Now I have opportunity to do this. The one is connected to the second book, Does Literature Think? And the second, which I can post later on, is connected to your and Buddy's conversation. So I really think that this is, let's say, great book connected to comparative literature. And in both of your books, Kafka, everybody who will read it will easily figure it out, is one of the most important figure of the author or writer's figure. And there are a lot of interpretations of various Kafka's works, short or not so short. But in this second book, Does Literature Think?, there are also some other very interesting authors. But what confused me, and I wasn't sure about this, how did you decide to connect these authors in one book? These are, for example, Flaubert, Borges, Genet, Delillo, and did I miss Brecht, of course, but Brecht is going somehow together with Benjamin. So if I'm talking about comparative literature of the 20th and 21st century, these are the names. All interpretations are great. I am warmly recommended all of these interpretations, but I missed the key of the connection between all these authors, and Stathis basically didn't offer explanation, or he didn't decode his intriguing choice. So I am using this opportunity to ask.
Yes. Okay. That's a yes. It's a central question. Thank you. Of course, Kafka somehow is above everyone. Not because he's better than everyone, but because he embodies what all these authors embody, which is that literature is a certain mode of thinking, which happens through, of course, a certain way of writing. And that is, in a very, very general sense, what threads these things together. But I will elaborate. I said that this is the closest to my training, and it's not just simply about comparative literature is my training, but also I'm trained as a modernist. So that means, you know, in essence, 20th century European literature, very traditional, really, if you think about it. I do a lot of different things, and I discuss all kinds of non-European matters a great deal, and I teach them. But this book really belongs and addresses some of the most canonical elements of the field, though in a very, very strange way. The problem that I had with this book is that I was claiming that literature provides a certain mode of knowledge that is different from analytical knowledge and from philosophical thinking, and yet most of the book is about philosophers. And also where the writers that you mentioned are used as counterweights or subversive figures. And the other problem which comes along with it was that I'm claiming that this knowledge that literature creates is not analytical. It happens, the understanding does not happen through breaking something down into its parts. That's what analytical thinking means. But happens synthetically, almost as a kind of, almost intuitively. There's a big discussion of intuition as a way of thinking in this book. And yet, this is the contradiction that I think is impossible to overcome. I had to write it in a language that is in some ways analytical. I mean, it's not poetry. I wasn't writing poetry, I was writing a philosophical book. So this contradiction is something that I was unable to resolve, and I didn't, in many ways, not care. So what threads these writers together are, on the one hand, a certain modernism that even the American writer Don DeLillo, who is a contemporary writer, is still living, shares. I'm rejecting the kind of postmodernism thesis as a different kind of writing. This is very controversial, and we can discuss it. Not that my position is correct necessarily. So one of it is modernism. The other is that the writing is what I call, it's theoretical writing in itself, in its own language, so it does not need a theory to explain it. When you read Kafka, you get an instant understanding of contemporary society, even the one that we still, we're living in, even though he wrote 100 years ago. So I was interested in that kind of what I call theoretical writing that literature specifically does, and all these writers do that. The third thing is that the writing is performative, not narrative, even though most of them are novelists. Well, Brecht is not, So that's very much against the grain. That needs to be discussed and questioned. I'm not suggesting it's correct, but that's my position. And the last thing is my own writing, which has to do with how a book like this is put together, which is really, the book I think has 10, well, it's 10 essays. I'm in favor of the essay as a form of writing. Not, again, the philosophical treatise, the analysis of concepts, something that's concept-driven, but more something that is driven from the standpoint of writing. And one might say this is a very strange book because it's 10 little books in one book. Condensed little books, all of them, brought together, not because there is a central thread that runs through them. So your question is very, very much the point. But more by juxtaposition, as we would say in English, right? Where just the sheer arrangement of these little exercises, these essays next to each other, may produce a sense of a whole that isn't necessarily fully explainable. So it's not. I'm not being just peculiar, not explaining. I am doing this on purpose. It is part of the way of writing. So this is a perfect question you asked.
Yes, because DeLillo was that point when I asked myself, what is the code for the choice? What is the hidden code? And of course, there is the very end of the book, which basically, in a way, discover the way of your writing, because the end of the book consists of, I don't know how many fragments.
Oh, the fragments, yes.
So we can say that basically your book did start with romanticism, not with enlightenment, as most of the readers would think. So I see fragment as a hidden code of your writing. All these long essays are in a way broken within, in some kind of, let's say, Benjamin's ruins. Personally, I have a deep love for fragment as a genre and as a form. So I also would like to ask, do you share this love for the fragment? Because this very end discover this, like, yes. And of course we can discuss about DeLillo later.
Yes, we might leave DeLillo for later or out altogether in that sense. But the fragment is very important. Yes, I love fragments. You're right to say that they're a romantic form. But then, apart from the fact that I've come to terms with myself now after all these years that I am in a sense a romantic, in my sensibility. I think that romanticism and modernism, there's not much difference between romanticism and modernism for me. I understand the important historical elements of differentiating between movements in specific instances, a century of difference between, the German romantics and Kafka writing in the same language. For me, the modernist problematic already occurs in a romantic thinking So the last part was a kind of experimental thing that I felt belonged to this book. I wrote it separately at one point for a whole. I was trying to think along the lines of Theodor Adorno and his Minima Moralia, which was the kind of model. And it is a model book for me. It has always been that. I am more Adornian than Derridian, though I am quite Derridian in the way that I read texts, but I'm more Adornian in my understanding. That's the formative part of my thinking. And then I thought, this is perfect. It belongs as a coda to this book that it itself is a bunch of fragments. Because though the essays may be complete, and there is a piece on Flaubert, let's say, that is really kind of about Flaubert, but really it's a fragment even about Flaubert analysis. So this is a coda in a kind of a musical sense. You know, the last part is as if you can say, you can take parts out of the book, fragments out of the book, and replay them or reconceive them in a certain way of writing that then shows what is the inner logic of the book. So Tanya, you're completely perceptive. You have completely unmasked the undercurrent of this book in ways that no one has, I have to say.
And for the first circle, you really do think that the Lilo is modernist? What are the arguments for this?
You're really hard. You're driving me very hard.
I will accept anything. I mean.
No. These are very serious questions. I don't know if I can actually defend myself here. Well, this particular book, the names, not just probably all of De Lillo, but the names. I don't know if the names has been translated in Serbian. Has it been translated in Serbian?
Yes.
The names. Okay. It is an extraordinary book. I hope if you have not read it, you have to read it. It's just a masterpiece. So the names is a even though when you read it, it's much easier to read, let's say, clearly than some modernist works like James Joyce or something, or Proust even. The writing is immediate. De Lillo writes in a way that actually brings the reader in very closely. The book is an incredibly fragmented view of contemporary reality that both distorts reality and yet elicits it in its sort of most concrete sense, which is what I think Kafka does. So it's also a theoretical book, as I say, because it has a whole theory of language and a political theory also of how societies both create their myths, which is a big part of this book. It's about myth making, and also destroy themselves from within. And though the book, historically speaking, belongs to the postmodern era, the era of global capital and of movement across borders, nonetheless, the way that it's written is kind of against the grain of that. That's the best I can do. Not very satisfactory, though. I think that I have to think more about it.